All right, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Beekeeping for Newbies. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. I do appreciate you. And as always, feel free to reach out, Jeff, at beekeepingfornewbies.com. That's NEWBEES.com. All right, folks, today is going to be a Bee Buzz episode. It's been a long time, and we have so many messages and questions coming in on a regular basis here. I usually will try to answer them on the fly as much as I can. Sometimes when we get the volume that we get at this time of year, it's like the floodgates are opened and everything starts pouring in at once. And, sometimes I can sit down and I can just do a nice long email and explain everything. Other times I have a day where there's so many of them coming in that I've got to kind of weigh it out. Like, do I work on the apprentice course? Do I work on the other projects that are going on? Or do I respond to emails all day? I would really like to just sit down and do emails all day because it's fun and it's engaging and it's a neat thing to do. But it doesn't get the information out there for everybody, so we got to kind of create a little bit of a balance. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to skip a lot of the Bee Buzz old school format where I would tell stories and talk about different things that are going on or whatever. We're not going to do that anymore. We're just going to go right to the meat of things here, dive right in. So the first message comes to us out of South Dakota. This is from Jenny. Oh, and what I'm doing real quick, so you know, I'm not going to read. Sometimes these questions in the emails will get pretty lengthy. I'm not going to read the entire message. We're going to go right to the question, get the question answered, and then we'll move on to the next one. We had 2 days in the mid-50s, so that's going to be Fahrenheit. For those of you in the Celsius area, that's like 12, 13 degrees Celsius. My bees were flying like crazy. Is that normal, or are they running out of food? So anytime the temperature, and again, it's going to vary a little bit based on your bees, the species, the race of bees, different types of areas geographically. Lots of variables can kind of come into play as to exactly what that temperature is going to be that they start flying. Good ballpark is around 50 degrees, plus or minus a few degrees. It is very normal for the temperature to get above whatever that threshold is for that colony and for that area. It's just normal cleansing flights. They're going to leave the hive as soon as they get the first opportunity. They're going to take care of their business. When we say cleansing flights, for those of you who are new, if I can get the words out of my mouth today, cleansing flights is just they're defecating, they're cleansing their bowels and their bodily wastes and just getting all of that cleared out. So they kind of they're stuck inside. It's pretty cold. And, once they get outside the hive, they don't have a lot of ability to generate enough heat to protect themselves as individuals, thus the need for them to stay in the cluster. So they kind of have to hold it and do the pee-pee poo-poo dance for many days or weeks or months on end until they get a chance. So those first few days, the temperature is above, they're going to leave the hive, they're going to go out and do their thing, perfectly normal activity. And of course, once it starts to get warm, that would be a typical, again, you get warm days in the middle of the winter all the time, but when you start getting some consistently warmer days, this is an indicator that spring may be right around the corner. So, of course, if the weather is getting warmer, they want to go out and start foraging, and that's what bees do. So once it gets over that threshold, the fact that you're seeing activity is a perfectly normal thing. All right, we've got Mark out of North Carolina. I see a pile of dead bees in front of one hive, but not the other. Should I be worried? So having bees die throughout the winter, it's a pretty normal thing. You don't want to have all of your bees die, but bees that die in the winter is a normal thing. A lot of times what happens is, just like we talked about with the cleansing flights just now, the bees aren't going to be able to leave the hive and do cleanup operations and get things done that they would normally like to do in warmer weather because, again, they're all stuck together staying warm. When it gets a little bit warm and they have a chance to start doing things, cleanup is one of their first activities. So they're going to go in and they're going to start dumping bees. Now, if you envision in your mind what a swarm looks like, when you think about a swarm hanging from a tree, and then take that and just kind of grab it from the tree and stick it inside the hive and think about roughly how big that is. If you're seeing that amount of bees outside the hive, that's a really big problem. But in that really big cluster that you'll see, typically a swarm cluster is not necessarily the same size as a overwintering bee cluster because, that many bees could potentially be incredibly inefficient. But think about, a good size, like basketball size cluster, and then imagine like over the winter, that's going to get smaller and smaller. So if you were to see, like a softball size, group of bees on the ground, that's probably relatively normal. Just bees doing housekeeping, getting rid of the dead, and getting rid of anything that should no longer be inside the hive. All right, next we've got Alicia out of Ontario. We're still getting nights in the teens in Fahrenheit. She said -7 to like -10 Celsius. Is it too early to check for the stores? I do recommend when you catch a warm day at the right time for you. Like for me, I've just kind of mentally put it on my mental calendar that the first warm day in February, I'm going to try to do a peek and do a little bit of an assessment. Very high level. This is like pop the outer cover, pop the inner cover, look as quickly as I can to the top hive body, whatever that might be. Hopefully I'm seeing some resources in there. I may be able to see exactly where the cluster is, get a good determination of where they are. And then I'm probably going to do a little bit of a lift test just from lifting up the back to see how heavy everything feels. I am not going to be pulling a lot of frames. One, if it's still really cold outside, I don't want all of that cold coming in and now they have to start over again. They've got a balance inside the hive of a temperature that's right for them that they need to maintain. I take that lid off, all that heat goes away. And in addition to all of the other challenges they're facing with trying to heat the hive and keep everything in a nice warm state, now I go and take the lid off and lose all their heat, making things even worse. At this time of year, a lot of places you're starting to get brood. You're starting to have brood development. So that even drives that need for warmth higher. And it drives that need for being aware and being very cautious of things even more, because they do have to maintain that higher temperature inside the cluster to protect that developing brood. So at this point, if the temps are that low, at night, it's not as big of a deal at nighttime as it is during the day, right? It's really the temperature that you're looking at things is the temperature that I recommend you really pay close attention to. Now, if you do decide to pull any frames out, I would be looking towards the edges to see where they are on the honey frames and not looking towards the middle where they're likely to have brood frames. All right, the next question comes to us from Ben out of Missouri or Missouri, depending on how you like to pronounce that one. One hive is active and the other isn't. Both were strong in the fall. Why? All colonies, for the most part, are going to progress differently due to just the way that they are, their genetics, their queen. They're all going to be just a little bit different. Some of them develop a larger cluster. They get more food resources. They consume more resources, but they finish the same. Some of them don't get as many resources, have a smaller cluster. They're able to maintain things well, explode in the spring. They all kind of operate a little bit differently. So having one of them be a little bit different from the other right now, not a big concern to me. Now, it is entirely possible that sometimes you'll have one that will have a discrepancy, like their activity level may be very comparable, very similar. But over the winter, their conditions were slightly different on the inside, and they may take a little bit longer to kind of ramp up. So if you were, say, a month, maybe 6 or 8 weeks from now, and you were noticing a real difference, you may think, hey, I think something may have happened with this colony. There is something going on that is different. Then I would probably be more concerned, probably even less than that, probably more like 4 weeks from now. I'd probably be looking to see them starting to balance out their activity a little bit more. Remember, it's going to be about 21 days to go from egg to new worker. So they're really ramping up those workers now. So if you give it about a month, I think things should start to equalize a little bit there. But I wouldn't be too concerned now. Now, if you're in a situation where you get a warm day, let's say it's 60 Fahrenheit, and the one hive is just jamming, there's bees coming in and out everywhere, very busy, and the other one is kind of onesie-twosying, then it might be a time to take a little look inside and see what's going on. They may have suffered a big loss, in the winter. And again, there are some colonies that get really, really, just right there on the edge of death, and they bounce back incredibly well. It doesn't take a whole lot of bees to start a new colony. Like as an example, when we use our cell builders, we use the cell builders to make queens, but we use our mini mating nukes. And we're only talking about like a cup of bees. We're talking like 300 to 500 bees that go into these little mini mating nukes and a queen cell, and that's it. And if you leave those things alone, after that queen comes back, they're going to swarm within like a week. They're going to be trying to swarm within a week. They will fill up those 3 little tiny frames with eggs. And next thing you know, there's a swarm cell in there, and they will pack and leave, and it'll just kind of be like a little repeating cycle, and it'll be a real mess for you. So they will absolutely explode in the spring under the right conditions. So just kind of stick with them. Don't give up on them just yet. All right, next we've got Rachel coming out of Pennsylvania, which is one of our big bee states. So a special shout out to our Pennsylvania crew. But Rachel says, my bees are bringing in pollen. Does that mean the queen is laying? I would generically kind of sort of say yes, but with a little bit of an asterisk to it. Just because they're bringing back pollen. I mean, I have bees that will fly in December and January and February. You get a nice warm day. There's always like that 1 or 2 days in January, 1 or 2 days in February where they go out and, in February, I kind of get it. That's when things do start to kind of open up and start to come into bloom. But like December and January, like it'll be completely cold. Then you have one random warm day and there's no opportunity for dandelion to grow in that scenario. It hasn't been warm enough and they'll just come back with pollen. And I'm baffled. I'm like, where did you find that? But just because they're bringing something back doesn't mean that the queen is laying. But as it is steadily coming back and it is sustained, absolutely the queen will be laying through that. All right, next we've got Steve out of Colorado. It's 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 Celsius, and there is no activity at my colony. Is this colony dead? So I would say that not necessarily. I think we touched on kind of some of the reasoning behind that a little bit earlier here, but if you have a smaller cluster and they're not quite as warm, they may need a little bit of a bump and a few more degrees to kind of get them, warmed up to a point where they want to fly. I would say if it gets much warmer, though, you start getting into like 55, 58, and even 60, and you're not seeing anything, you definitely want to intervene and take some action on that. All right, Matt out of Georgia. Should I remove my entrance reducer now? So entrance reducers are always kind of one of those many religious kind of discussions that we often have. I have had hives completely wide open all winter, and it hasn't been an issue. I have done the 3/4 to 1 inch opening and it hasn't been an issue. Now I'm mostly doing like the 3 to 4 inch opening. Again, not an issue. But I still think that being wide open like I used to do that, I don't think that's the best idea. I really don't. I haven't actually done a lot of formal measurement in it to say what the differences are, but I think it is allowing just a little bit too much cool air in. So I'm not doing that anymore. But anyway, I would not be removing entrance reducers right now. Let's just assume that you're at that 3/4 to 1 inch entrance. That is plenty of room. Even in the peak of a nectar flow, if you've got a 1 inch entrance, the bees are going to be fine. In fact, most of the studies around entrance size that is preferred by the bees put that at about a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to try to guess this on centimeters. I think it's 2.54 centimeters per inch. So you'd be looking at like 3 1/4 centimeters, something like that, maybe 3.5 centimeters. But an 1.25 inches or an 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches is about that range that's ideal for a honeybee hive that is looking for a space in a tree. So you don't have to be wide open. You don't have to be at 3 to 4 inches. But right now you do still have issues with, things getting cooler at night. You have that diminished population. Just anything that you can do now that's going to change what they've been doing successfully so far, I wouldn't mess around with it. Now, a lot of times you'll say, well, I keep the entrances smaller to reduce robbing. Robbing isn't as big of an issue, it's really generally not an issue in the spring, because in the spring, the resources tend to be abundant everywhere, and you're not trying to deter others from coming in. But just broadly, generically, I should say, speaking, don't mess with the entrance reducers. If they've made it this far, leave it alone and, worry about tightening it up later on in the season. Or I should even say opening it up further if you like to. Like a lot of people just wide open all summer long. And if that's what you can do safely and you're not dealing with robbing events or anything like that, by all means. But no hurry, no need to rush right now. All right, we've got Karen out of Michigan. My hive feels light. Should I add sugar or a pollen patty? So this is that time of year where, as you guys know, that I do kind of tend to intervene a little bit if it makes sense to do so. Now, how one gauges light obviously is a bit subjective, but the real driver behind that unit of measurement, however it is for you, it should be, okay, I recognize that this is significantly lighter than what it was when I either took an actual measurement or when I kind of ballparked it with my hand. Whatever the method is that you use to determine that it is in fact kind of quote unquote light, that's your basis of comparison. So when you say, okay, this is definitely light, now what do I do? At this time of year, this is a ramp up time typically. So if we were at the end of the end of the summer, I'm recommending a 2-to-1 sugar syrup. I want them to take in as much of that as they can, put it away. If for some reason, you're a big fan and big proponent of overwinter feeding, then that's when you want to get your carb heavy feeds. So whether it's going to be like your fondant or your candy boards or your, carb heavy pollen patties, whatever it is that you're going to be giving, great thing to put in, way earlier in the winter, late fall, early winter type of thing. As it gets to this time of year and they're kind of dwindling, they're getting the last of that honey that they're using to stay warm, maybe even using some of that sugar resource to help make that royal jelly and start really ramping things up. This is that time of year where you may opt to go with a slightly, heavier protein side patty. As far as anything sugar related go, I know that in the email, Karen, you specifically mentioned like dry sugar. I have never, literally never in my life put dry sugar inside of a beehive. I stopped overwinter feeding bees at all in I think it was 2013 or 14. I'll just say 2014. So 2014, over 10 years ago, I stopped putting anything in my beehives over the winter. And I do not have bees at my house today. They'll be here in a few weeks. But historically, I'm between 88 to 92% ballpark in my overwintering success. I'm not losing honeybees to starvation. It's just not happening. But that's a whole separate discussion to have. So at this point, if you have warm, nice days, and you recognize that it's warm, but a lot of things have not yet started to come into bloom, whether it's trees, bushes, plants, flowers, trees, anything that may be typical for you. Like I said, we get a lot of maple this time of year, maple and elm and some other trees and bushes are going to start coming in. If whatever typically blooms in your area as your spring flow, the beginning of your spring nectar flow has not yet begun, you can definitely consider putting out some kind of a sugar syrup or something like that. You can do it in the hive in a frame feeder, which I'm, of course, a big proponent of feeding in the hive. It's just that as these temperatures aren't really quite warm enough to be spending a lot of time in the hive, you may want to look at some alternatives. Now, you can do other types of feeders as well. You have options to do like a feeder that would be sitting on top of your outer cover, and it's just plugged when not in use. So you could absolutely pop out the plug and put your top feeder on that. There would not be anything wrong with, adding some other type of non-invasive feed solution that keeps it isolated, to that individual colony. Nothing wrong with that as well. So a couple of options there, but I guess the key takeaway is if they're feeling light, and I know Michigan gets a little funny. I mean, you get a lot of those fake springs up there, and they ramp up fast, and it can be 20 degrees and snowing again in April or something like that. So it can get a little bit funny up there. But if they're definitely light, and you still have several weeks to go, you may want to find some type of intervention that's going to be the right fit for you. All right, we've got Lewis coming out of Texas. We had a warm spell and then a hard freeze. Can that kill the brood? So that's kind of a timely question because that's something that happens all the time at this time of year. And I think we may have talked about this actually within the past couple of days in the previous episode. But you have this big challenge where the bees are ramping up really, really big time here in the spring. You got your nectar flow coming in. The bees are using the last of the resources that they kept for overwinter. They may have some bee bread there they were holding on to help ramp up that spring brood. And they get to that point where you have winter bees are aging off and starting to die. Your spring bees haven't yet been born. And they're trying to stay in a nice cluster to keep the brood warm and even warmer than they were keeping themselves. And then they've got to move other places in the hive to get stored honey because it's so cold. They've got to relocate. So there's a lot of challenges and obstacles. But the short answer is yes, absolutely. And I think I still have pictures somewhere. I should probably post them so that everybody can see them. But I had that happen to me on more than one occasion. But there's this one that just sticks out in my mind. I had this great little colony, and I think that there were like 5 frames of brood. They had just gone completely insane. And then one day they just dropped off. And we had a little bit of a cold spell, and I came out and they were just dead. That was it. And I went inside, and there were like 5 frames of completely beautiful, packed out, dead brood, still capped, just sitting there. So yeah, it's really unfortunate. It does happen, and that's where, coming up with some supplemental feed of some sort is not a bad idea in the spring to give them a little bit before that spring flow kicks in. And we have Emily here from Virginia. How do I know if they're starving without pulling frames? I would say the 2 things that you're going to want to pay attention to is the overall hive weight, which of course, unless you're, a big, strong gal, and you just grab the hive and just, lift it up and say, okay, this one's feeling a little light, a little bit tricky, but there's kind of like that lift test. You can kind of lift from the back a little bit and see how many fingers you have to use to kind of lift it up and get a ballpark from that. But the other thing is going to be positionally speaking. Let's just say that generically you had a couple of deeps and a medium honey super on there. As they're working their way up, that whole top honey super up top should be kind of the end for them, because the next thing is your inner and outer cover. If you pop that outer cover, look at the inner cover, you take that off as well, and then you're looking down from the top, and all of the bees are right there at the top, and you can look in the sides, even pull a frame if you want to while you're there. Pull a couple of those frames on the side, and if you see there's no resources left, obviously that's a huge indicator. But when they get all the way up there to the very top, and of course, obviously the hive's a little bit light, those are a couple of really strong indicators that they're running low. Now, there's a textbook thing. Somebody sent me this picture the other day, or they posted it in the Discord room. You get that frame of bees with the butts sticking out of the cells where they're all head first into the cell trying to find some little scrap of food, and they're all dead. It's just so unfortunate and sad to see that. But yeah, generally the position of that cluster with regard in relationship to where the honey is or was and the overall weight are going to be probably your best indicators. We got Doug out of Iowa. Bees are clustered near the top. Is that normal? It's kind of cool how the questions all feed each other a little bit. So as I just was mentioning a minute ago, as the colony kind of moves around, they consume the resources throughout the hive, and they work their way up to the top. So them clustering at and going up to the top, that's pretty normal. And then of course, as it gets warm and the weather starts to improve, then we should start seeing the queen laying up and the bees working their way back down. All right, we got Natalie out of Kentucky. Is it too early to add a super? I would pretty much say yes, with a kind of little bit of an asterisk on that, as always. If you are down in the south, in the southern part of the U.S., there are people there right now. We had one of our Discord members yesterday who just did a split yesterday. So we're in the first week of March, and they're already splitting. I was talking to somebody else in North Carolina a couple days ago. They've got, queen cells in development right now. So there is already some swarm pressure kicking in. And if your temperatures will support it, if the size of the colony will support it, you can add more space. You just need to remember that when you add more space, it's, more of an area for the bees to manage from a temperature standpoint. But, a lot of colonies that come out of the winter really, really strong, they explode so fast and they grow so fast that they're able to handle that. But I would still give it just a little bit more time. Again, for most of the country, if you're in the South, you probably want to go ahead and get one on there. Just kind of gauge it in line with what you see with swarm cell activity. If they're creating swarm cells, they're telling you, in combination with some pheromonal things, they're telling you, hey, I think we're running out of space and we need more room, so we're probably going to think about swarming. That's one component of things, so you definitely want to consider it. But again, in Kentucky, most of Kentucky right now, and anything north, Virginia, Kentucky, and further north, I would try to hold off a little bit longer. But the real decision is going to come from the size of your colony. If they are really starting to explode and getting big and they're short on space and queen cups are popping up everywhere, a few of them are starting to get loaded up with queen cells, or I should say with developing larval queens, then, absolutely add. All right, next we've got Chris out of Minnesota. I heard loud buzzing during a cold snap. Bad sign? No. So the bees are going to use their wing muscles, the same muscles that they use to fly with. They use them in a different way, but it's the same muscles that they're going to use to warm that cluster. So the bees, they all cluster together, and there's that vibration of the wing muscles. They're generating heat, and that's pretty par for the course. Nothing unusual with that. Now, if you happened to bump the hive, or you made contact with it in some way, of course they may do a little bit of a hey. That's kind of like, I don't know if any other way to describe it. That's just in my mind. That's what I hear. Like if I bump a hive and there's that little roar that just trickles through the whole hive. It's like, hey. I know I'm a weirdo. Just play along with me. But that's obviously something that they do when they are alarmed and they are concerned and they're trying to let everybody know that, something is not exactly right. But what you're hearing, it sounds like, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's just a little bit of the bees doing what they got to do to stay warm. All right, next we've got Olivia out of New York. When should I do my first real inspection? Now, when I hear real inspection, that to me means not just your quick glance in the hive to see how high up the cluster is and what their resources look like. This means pulling frames. I love to have it around 70 Fahrenheit. I recognize that's not always practical, and sometimes we don't get that. I'm pretty baffled right now because I looked at our long-range forecast today. In fact, I'm pulling it up again right now. But the 10-day forecast for me, starting with tomorrow, it's in the 60s. And like every day except for day 10 is all in the 70s. So that's perfect opportunity to do a full inspection. Now, again, I do want you to try to be sensitive and mindful of that developing brood, right? We got to keep the brood warm. There's going to be nurse bees all over that brood trying to keep them warm. Just be cognizant of that when you're doing temperature. When you're doing inspections at these lower temperatures, just be aware that you don't want to take that brood frame out, look at it and be like, cool, what a great pattern, and then hang it on the outside. I like the little hangers, and you can hang stuff on the outside while, to give you a little bit more space while you're digging around. Nothing wrong with that. But with your brood frames at times of year when it's cold, take a look at them, put them back in. Let the bees maintain as much of that warmth as they possibly can. But yeah, target anything probably above that 60 to 65 Fahrenheit, like 15 to 18 Celsius kind of range. That's probably a good point for you to be able to get in and start really assessing things. And remember, early on, you don't have to go crazy, right? These first few inspections, it's how are things looking? Are they bringing back pollen, nectar? Are eggs present? Do I see that the queen is actively laying? You don't have to go through every single frame until you find the queen. Do I see eggs and young larvae? Are they bringing in resources? Does the population look healthy? Roughly how many frames of bees do I have? Great, looks good. Close it up and go on about your business. All right, we've got one from Aaron in Oklahoma. He says, the long story short here is he's got a small cluster. Should I combine this now or just wait? So this is kind of a tough question here. And I know we did briefly touch on this in the last episode about the idea of kind of like rebalancing and things like that. I'm not a proponent of, taking from a strong hive and giving to a weak hive to boost them up. I don't like that idea. I'm 100% on board with the scenario where you say, geez, this colony barely overwintered. They are struggling. They're not healthy. They don't appear to be ramping up. And then just merging them with another colony. I'm completely fine with that. But you may, just because they have trimmed down and they're really light and they're not quite big yet, I would give them a little bit of a chance. Take a look and see if there is brood present. If they've got nurse bees over that brood protecting them, if hive activity is ramping up and things seem to be, getting busier on the warmer days, I wouldn't give up on them just yet. Because like I said before, there are some colonies and there are some queens with the genetics of being able to really, really finely manage that fine line. I mean, it's a really fine line between life and death quite often coming out of the winter. And some of the queens have that genetic ability to where they maintain that line really, really well, and they have just the right amount of resources to get through, and they ramp up incredibly well. You may have that tiny little cluster right now that is bursting at the seams 2 months from now, you've got 3 boxes on it, there's bees everywhere, they will ramp up really, really quickly. So I would not be combining them with another colony yet, unless you're in a situation where you feel like the activity is almost absent, you're not seeing any brood, the activity is low. You may even be concerned about the well-being of the queen. Like any of those scenarios would make me say, okay, you may want to reevaluate that. All right, everybody. Well, look, I think we made it through 15 questions today. I kind of had to go lightning round on that. I went a little bit quicker than I usually do. But the problem is this list has 52 questions on it, and I made it through 15. So I'm not even going to try to do the math on all that. What is that going to be? 37 more? I think I have 37 more that I have to get to in this list. That does not include today's emails. That doesn't include yesterday's emails. So I'm just going to have to lightning round these from now on just to make sure we can get all these questions answered. Now, what I would be interested in is if you out there hear these questions and something resonates to you or something answered a question you have that you hadn't answered, let me know. Whether it's a comment, in the like I know Spotify has an ability to make comments in there. Please feel free to leave reviews and comments, by the way. I read all those comments. They only notify me once a week, but I do read them. But let me know either there or email me or come into our Discord room and let me know like, hey, these really resonate. These are really helpful. Because I've heard people for years have said like, oh, wow, that was really kind of neat when you answered this question about this one topic. But I just want to make sure that we're answering the mail and that this is relevant for you and that it's helpful, because my goal as we're now going into, I think it's our 6th season here with the podcast, and I am trying to really get laser focused, which is kind of like an oxymoron with me, like the idea of being focused while simultaneously being all over the map. But I'm trying to get laser focused on things that are important, things that are relevant, and I want to try to cut out things that maybe weren't. Like there are a lot of people who used to say, oh, I really enjoy all the stories you're telling me about the apiary and what you're doing down there. It's really cool. I also had a lot of people who were like, hey, I like you. I think you're a swell guy, but I really don't care about your RV or your sawmill or your pile of wood that you need to burn and all these other things. So, the overwhelming majority was like, I like you. I think you're okay, but I really don't care about the stuff. So we're trimming some of those things out. But I just want to make sure that you're getting something that is relevant, it's actionable, it's useful, and that when you press play, you're getting information that can make a difference for you, because I don't want to waste your time. All right, so we are continuing development on the apprentice course. We're releasing that here in the next couple of months. I'll have more info for you as soon as I have that lined up. Thank you so much for your support. Consider buying me a coffee if you'd like to give me something to drink, because I am a little bit thirsty today. And check us out on beekeepingfornewbies.com, youtube.com/@beekeepingfornewbies. And always remember that I love you and there's nothing you can do about it. We'll talk to you soon.